The lights on the council chamber floor dimmed for the third time that hour, and Elena Voss felt her pulse rise before she even understood why. She had spent 6 years inside this building, seated at the farthest edge of the observer section, watching alien delegates trade insults dressed as diplomacy. Tonight was supposed to be routine. Tonight was supposed to be nothing more than another quiet session where Earth's name was read aloud, noted, and ignored. But something in the air felt different, and Elena had learned long ago to trust that feeling. She sat very still, her hands folded on the polished black table in front of her, watching hundreds of delegates from dozens of worlds shuffle into their seats. The chamber itself was a marvel, a floating dome, suspended above a sea of glowing clouds, on a planet called Visara, the administrative heart of the Galactic Council. Massive columns of light rose from the floor to the ceiling, each one representing a member species. Earth's column, thin and pale blue, barely reached a third of the height of the others. It had always been that way. It was a visible symbol of a truth nobody needed to say aloud. Humanity did not belong yet, and might never belong. Elena adjusted the small translator device clipped to her collar, the one that let her understand the dozens of languages spoken around her. She glanced toward the human delegation beside her, a small group of scientists and diplomats who had been sent to observe, to learn, to survive on scraps of goodwill. There was Daniel Hughes, a former engineer turned political liaison, sharp-eyed and quiet, always taking notes. Beside him sat Grace Whitfield, a physicist whose brilliance had earned her a seat at Elena's side, though she rarely spoke unless asked. The three of them made up the entirety of Earth's presence in a chamber that held representatives from over 400 worlds. For years, this had been enough. Humanity had clawed its way into a fragile alliance after first contact nearly 2 decades earlier, when a Council scout vessel had detected radio signals leaking from Earth, and decided, almost as an afterthought, to establish contact. What followed was not celebration but humiliation. Humanity learned quickly that it was among the youngest, weakest, and least respected civilizations in the galaxy. The Council granted Earth what it called observer status, a title that sounded diplomatic but functioned as a leash. Observers could listen. Observers could not vote. Observers could not object. Observers existed to be tolerated, not heard. Elena had accepted this role because the alternative was worse. Early in her tenure, she had watched a delegation from a newly discovered world attempt to argue for greater rights, only to be quietly removed from the Council roster within a year, their species reclassified as unfit for further contact. Nobody knew what became of them. Elena had learned to swallow her pride, to nod when she wanted to argue, to smile when she wanted to shout. It was the only way to keep humanity's fragile foothold among the stars. Tonight, the session opened as it always did, with the Council speaker rising to address matters of trade, territory, and resource allocation across the outer systems. Elena listened carefully, translating not just words but tone, watching which delegates leaned forward with interest, and which leaned back with boredom. Earth's business was minor tonight, a request for expanded mining rights in an asteroid belt near the edge of human space. It was a modest ask, one that should have passed without comment. But as the speaker called for input on Earth's request, a figure rose from the upper tier of the chamber, where the oldest and most powerful species sat in seats reserved for founding members of the Council. Elena recognized him immediately. Lord Calith Dravorn, senior delegate of the Thren Dominion, one of the founding species of the Council, and a being who had never once addressed Earth's delegation with anything resembling respect. He was tall, pale, and moved with the slow confidence of someone who had never been told no in his long life. Elena felt Daniel stiffen beside her. Grace's pen paused mid-note. The chamber quieted as Lord Dravorn's voice, amplified and translated instantly into every language present, filled the dome. He began calmly enough, questioning the wisdom of granting further resources to a species with, in his words, no proven contribution to galactic stability. Elena had heard variations of this argument before. She braced herself for the usual condescension, the usual reminder of humanity's place. But Lord Dravorn was not finished. He continued, his tone sharpening, describing Earth not merely as young or inexperienced, but as something else entirely. He called it a diseased nursery, a phrase that landed in the chamber like a struck bell, one that would be repeated, translated, and broadcast to every world with access to council records within hours. Elena did not move. She could not move. The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, nobody in the chamber reacted at all, as though waiting to see whether she would. Around her, the human delegation sat frozen. Daniel's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing along his cheek, but he said nothing. Grace's eyes had gone wide, her pen forgotten entirely. Elena felt heat rise in her chest, a burning she had not allowed herself to feel in years, not since her earliest days on Visara, when every insult still cut fresh. She had trained herself to absorb these moments, to let them pass, to protect the fragile position Earth still held. But something about tonight refused to be absorbed. She thought, in that instant, of home, of her sister back on Earth, raising 2 children in a world still recovering from its own long history of conflict and division, of the astronauts who had come before her, the ones who had looked up at unfamiliar stars and dared to hope humanity might one day stand among them as equals. Of every quiet compromise she had made across 6 years, every insult she had swallowed for the sake of patience. The council speaker moved to continue the session, treating Lord Dravern's words as nothing more than an aside, a minor comment unworthy of further attention. It was this dismissal, more than the insult itself, that finally broke something loose in Elena. She realized, with sudden clarity, that if she said nothing now, the words would simply become part of the record, absorbed into the endless archive of things said about Earth that Earth was never permitted to answer. She stood. The motion was small, almost nothing, but in a chamber built on centuries of rigid protocol, an observer standing without being called upon was as shocking as a shout. Every column of light in the dome seemed to flicker in response. Or perhaps Elena only imagined it. Daniel reached toward her sleeve, a silent warning, but she did not sit back down. Elena Voss spoke without being granted permission, her voice steady, despite the pounding in her chest. And for the first time in 6 years, an observer from Earth addressed the Galactic Council, not as a guest, asking to be tolerated, but as someone demanding to be heard. She did not shout, she did not threaten, she spoke plainly, describing the long history of struggle that had brought humanity to this chamber at all, the wars survived, the divisions overcome, the sheer improbability of a species clawing its way from stone tools to starlight in the span of a few thousand years. She reminded the council that Earth had asked for little since its arrival, had caused no conflict, had broken no treaty, and had endured insult after insult in silence, out of respect for a system it hoped to one day belong to. She did not ask for an apology. She said only that Earth would remember this moment, and that silence should never again be mistaken for weakness. The chamber remained utterly still as she finished. Lord Dravorn's expression did not change, though something in his posture suggested mild irritation at having been answered at all. The council speaker, visibly uncertain how to proceed, called for a brief recess, and the session dissolved into murmured conversation across 100 different tongues. Elena sat back down, her hands trembling slightly now that the moment had passed. Daniel leaned close, his voice low. He asked if she understood what she had just done, breaking protocol so openly in front of the entire council. Elena did not answer immediately. She was staring at the small blue column of light that represented Earth, thinner than every other column in the chamber, and wondering whether anything would ever be the same again. She did not have to wait long for her answer. By the time the recess ended and the delegates filed back to their seats, a runner from the council's communications office arrived at the human delegation's table, informing Elena, in hushed, urgent tones, that footage of her exchange with Lord Dravorn had already begun circulating across the council's public information network. The network reached every member world, including Earth, where relay stations maintained by the small Earth Space Authority received council broadcasts on a slight delay. Elena felt her stomach drop. She had not considered, in the heat of the moment, that her words would travel home before she had a chance to explain them, to soften them, to prepare her own government for what she had done. She thought of the fragile peace maintained between Earth's nations since first contact, a peace built partly on the understanding that humanity's place among the stars depended on patience and restraint. She wondered whether she had just shattered that peace with a single unscripted moment of defiance. Daniel excused himself briefly to check the delegation's private communications terminal, tucked into a side room off the main chamber reserved for member species too minor to warrant a full embassy. When he returned, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of concern and something else Elena could not quite identify. He told her that Earth's networks were already flooded with the clip. Within an hour of the broadcast reaching Earth's atmosphere, translations had spread across every major language and platform on the planet. People who had never paid attention to council proceedings before, who barely understood what the observer status even meant, were sharing the footage, watching Lord Dravorn's words again and again, watching Elena rise to answer him. Grace, who had remained silent since the incident, finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. She said that whatever came next, whatever consequences followed, at least Earth's silence had finally been broken by someone who understood the cost of breaking it. Elena did not feel comforted by this. She felt only the weight of uncertainty, the sense that she had set something into motion that she no longer controlled. The session resumed an hour later, subdued and awkward. Delegates avoiding eye contact with the human table, as though embarrassed by what had transpired. Earth's request for mining rights was approved without further comment, an outcome that felt almost meaningless now, dwarfed entirely by the moment that had preceded it. When the session finally ended, Elena remained in her seat long after the chamber had emptied, staring up at the fading light of Earth's column. She thought about the years of careful diplomacy she had built, the relationships cultivated, the trust slowly earned. She wondered whether all of it had just been undone in a matter of seconds. She did not yet know that, hundreds of light-years away, on a planet that had spent decades believing itself alone and unimportant in a universe far larger than it could comprehend, something had shifted permanently. She did not know that in cities across every continent, people were gathering in front of screens, watching footage of a woman they had never heard of stand up to a being none of them fully understood, and feeling, for the first time in a long while, a flicker of something like pride. Elena Voss did not know, sitting alone in that vast empty chamber, that she had just become the reason humanity would never be quiet again. Daniel found her there eventually, offering no words of comfort, only a quiet presence beside her, as the dome's lights dimmed further into the artificial night cycle, maintained for the comfort of visiting delegates. He told her that whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. Elena appreciated the sentiment, though she suspected that what came next would be far larger than either of them could face alone, larger than the delegation, larger than the council itself. Somewhere far below the floating chamber, in the depths of Visara's administrative archives, the recording of her words was already being copied, translated, and distributed to every corner of council space. The insult meant to remind humanity of its place had instead become the spark of something the council had never anticipated, something that would ripple outward across the galaxy in ways none of them could yet imagine. Elena finally rose from her seat as the chamber lights dimmed to near darkness, Daniel and Grace following close behind. As they made their way toward the exit, none of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts about what the coming days might bring. Behind them, Earth's thin blue column of light remained steady, unremarkable among the towering columns of older worlds, and yet somehow, for the first time since Elena had arrived on Visara, it did not feel quite so small. The three of them stepped out into the corridor beyond the chamber, where the artificial stars of Visara's ceiling stretched endlessly overhead, and Elena allowed herself, just for a moment, to wonder what her sister back home was thinking as she watched the footage play across every screen on Earth. She wondered whether people were angry, frightened, proud, or some tangled mixture of all three. She wondered whether the fragile unity the footage seemed to be sparking could possibly last. She had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning, that the words spoken in a single evening session would echo across star systems for months to come, reaching ears and minds she could not yet imagine, setting into motion events that would test humanity in ways it had never been tested before. All she knew, walking through the quiet corridors of a building built by species far older and more powerful than her own, was that she had finally said what needed to be said, and that whatever came next, Earth would not face it in silence again. The footage reached Earth before the sun had fully risen over the city of Nairobi, where Henry Cross sat in a small government office, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and stacks of unread reports. He was not a diplomat or a scientist. He was a former logistics officer who had spent the last decade quietly building relationships between Earth's rival space agencies, trying to convince proud nations to share resources they had once guarded jealously. When his assistant burst into his office without knocking, phone in hand, playing the clip of Elena Voss rising to answer Lord Dravorn, Henry felt something he had not felt in years working within the slow, frustrating machinery of international cooperation. He felt hope mixed with fear. Within hours, the clip had been translated into every major language on the planet, subtitled, remixed, shared across every platform still functioning after the long communication blackouts of the previous decade. People who had never once thought about the Galactic Council, who barely understood what observer status meant, found themselves watching the same 9 seconds over and over. The moment when a woman representing their entire species stood up without permission and refused to be dismissed. Henry watched the reactions ripple outward with a mixture of awe and concern. Social feeds that had been fractured by old rivalries suddenly filled with a strange, unfamiliar unity. Citizens of nations that had barely spoken to each other in years found common ground in outrage over a single phrase spoken by an alien lord light years away. Comment sections filled with anger, yes, but also something else. A kind of collective pride that Henry had not witnessed since the earliest days of human spaceflight, when the whole planet had watched footprints appear on the moon. By mid-morning, Henry received an urgent summons to an emergency session of the newly reformed Earth Coordination Assembly, a body created in the uneasy years following first contact to manage humanity's collective response to galactic affairs. It had always been a fragile institution, prone to gridlock, weighed down by old grudges between nations still recovering from decades of conflict and mistrust. Henry expected today's session to be no different. He was wrong. He arrived at the assembly hall to find representatives from nearly every major nation already seated, an unusually high turnout for a body that regularly struggled to reach quorum. The mood in the room was different too, charged with an energy Henry had never witnessed in these halls before. Delegates who normally spent meetings sparring over minor trade disputes sat quietly, watching the same footage play on screens mounted around the chamber, the image of Lord Dravorn's cold expression and Elena Voss's steady voice looping endlessly. The session opened, not with the usual procedural formalities, but with a single question posed by the Assembly's rotating chair, a diplomat from a nation that had spent the last 2 years locked in disputes with its neighbors over water rights. She asked simply whether the Assembly intended to let this moment pass unanswered, or whether Earth was finally ready to become something more than an audience to its own humiliation. What followed was unlike any session Henry had witnessed in his years of service. Nations that had refused to share satellite data began offering full access. Agencies that had guarded proprietary engine designs for decades proposed joint development programs. A representative from a country whose space program had been grounded for years due to funding cuts offered its remaining scientists and engineers to any coalition willing to take them. It was as though a single insult, broadcast across the stars, had done what decades of careful diplomacy never could, stripping away old divisions and revealing something simpler underneath, a shared identity, as a species that had just been called diseased and unworthy in front of the entire galaxy. Henry found himself at the center of drafting proposals he had once considered impossible dreams, sketching frameworks for what would eventually become known as the Earth Defense Compact, a coalition uniting military, scientific, and industrial resources across every spacefaring nation on the planet. It was not conceived as a declaration of war. Nobody in that chamber believed Earth capable of challenging the Council militarily. Not yet. Not against species who had been navigating the stars for millennia before humanity had learned to smelt iron. But it was conceived as something else, a statement that Earth intended to stop being an afterthought. By the end of that first emergency session, the Assembly had approved funding for a joint research initiative unlike anything humanity had attempted before, pooling together the scattered, underfunded space programs of 100 nations into a single coordinated effort. Old rivalries did not disappear entirely. Old suspicions lingered beneath the surface of every negotiation. But for the first time in decades, humanity moved with something resembling unity of purpose. In the weeks that followed, Henry watched projects long abandoned for lack of funding suddenly find new life. A prototype propulsion system developed years earlier by a small European research team, shelved after budget cuts, was revived under the compact's new joint funding structure. Engineers who had left the aerospace industry for more stable careers returned, drawn back by the sense that something larger than any single national program was finally underway. Universities across the planet reported surges in applications to physics and engineering programs. Young people inspired by the sudden, urgent sense that humanity's place among the stars was no longer a distant abstraction, but an immediate, pressing concern. Not everyone welcomed the shift. Some world leaders worried publicly that provoking the Council, even indirectly, risked consequences Earth was in no position to withstand. Editorials appeared in major publications warning against what some called reckless nationalism, dressed up as unity, cautioning that humanity's newfound pride could easily curdle into something more dangerous if left unchecked. Henry understood these concerns. He shared some of them privately, lying awake some nights wondering whether the momentum building across the planet might carry humanity somewhere it was not prepared to go. But he also understood something else, something harder to articulate in policy papers or diplomatic cables. He understood that for the first time since first contact, Earth was choosing its own direction, rather than simply reacting to decisions made by others. Elena Voss remained on Visara throughout this period, continuing her duties as Earth's observer, even as her status within the Council shifted in subtle, uncomfortable ways. Delegates who had once ignored her entirely now watched her with wary attention whenever she entered a room. Lord Dravern himself made no further public comments regarding Earth, though Elena noticed him watching her from across the chamber during sessions, his expression unreadable, his silence somehow more unsettling than his earlier insult had been. Grace Whitfield spent long hours in the small research annex attached to the human delegation's offices, communicating with scientists back on Earth as the Joint Propulsion Initiative began producing early results. She had always believed humanity possessed the raw talent to close the technological gap separating it from older Council species, if only given the resources and unity to attempt it. Watching that theory begin to prove true, watching data streams from Earth's laboratories fill with breakthroughs achieved at a pace nobody had thought possible, filled her with a cautious optimism she rarely allowed herself to express openly. Daniel Hughes, meanwhile, found himself increasingly occupied with a task he had never expected to take on, serving as an informal liaison between the Compact's growing military coordination efforts back on Earth and the delegation's presence within Council space. He spent hours each week reviewing reports on ship designs, weapons research, and defensive strategy, translating the abstract concerns of Earth's engineers into terms the delegation could use to assess how the Council might perceive humanity's growing capabilities. He was careful, in every report he filed, to frame the Compact's efforts as defensive rather than provocative, aware that even the appearance of aggression could unravel the fragile position Earth still held within Council space. Word of Earth's sudden mobilization inevitably reached Council ears, though the response was slower and more dismissive than Henry or Elena had expected. Council intelligence services, accustomed to monitoring far more advanced civilizations for signs of military buildup, initially categorized Earth's activities as minor and unthreatening, the natural posturing of a young species reacting emotionally to a diplomatic slight. Reports filed by Council analysts described humanity's efforts in condescending terms, predicting that whatever momentum had been generated by Lord Dravorn's comments would fade within months, as internal divisions inevitably reasserted themselves. This assessment was not entirely wrong. There were setbacks, disagreements, moments when old rivalries threatened to fracture the Compact's fragile unity. A dispute over which nation's shipyards would host the Compact's first joint construction facility nearly collapsed negotiations entirely, resolved only after weeks of tense diplomacy and a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but preserved the coalition's momentum. Funding disputes flared periodically, particularly among smaller nations concerned that their contributions were being overshadowed by larger, wealthier partners. But the underlying current of unity, however imperfect, persisted in a way that surprised even Henry, who had spent years watching similar initiatives collapse under the weight of national self-interest. He came to believe that something about the specific nature of the insult, the accusation that Earth was diseased and unworthy, had cut deeper than any previous diplomatic slight, touching something more fundamental than pride. It was not merely that humanity had been insulted. It was that humanity had been dismissed as fundamentally lesser, incapable of ever truly belonging among the stars. That particular wound, Henry came to understand, was one that resonated across every culture and nation on the planet, regardless of the divisions that normally kept them apart. By the time 6 months had passed since Elena's unscripted response in the council chamber, the Earth Defense Compact had grown into something far larger than its early architects had imagined, a coordinated effort spanning military research, scientific development, and industrial production across dozens of nations. Prototype vessels, still crude by council standards but far more advanced than anything Earth had produced before, began undergoing testing in facilities scattered across the planet and in low orbit. Training programs for a new generation of pilots and engineers expanded rapidly, drawing recruits from every corner of the globe united by a singular, unspoken purpose. Elena, watching these developments unfold from her position on Visara, felt a complicated mixture of pride and apprehension. She had not intended, in that single moment of defiance, to set in motion a mobilization of this scale. She had only meant to speak the truth as she understood it, to refuse to let an insult pass unanswered. But watching the ripple effects spread outward across her home planet, she began to understand that her words had tapped into something far larger than herself, a collective frustration that had been building quietly for decades, waiting only for a spark. She wrote to Henry regularly during this period, careful coded messages relayed through the delegation's limited communication channels, urging caution even as she privately admired the resolve taking shape back home. She reminded him, again and again, that whatever Earth built in the coming months needed to remain a deterrent rather than a provocation, that the goal was never conflict but respect, never war but recognition. Henry agreed with her in every message he sent back, though privately he wondered whether the distinction between deterrent and provocation would remain as clear once the Council finally noticed what Earth had truly accomplished. That moment of recognition, though neither Elena nor Henry could have known it yet, was coming far sooner than either of them expected. Oliver Bates had never expected to become a pilot for anything larger than the small survey aircraft he flew for a regional weather service before the Compact recruited him. He was 32 years old, steady-handed, and possessed a rare gift for remaining calm under pressure that his instructors had noticed almost immediately during his transition into the Compact's new pilot training program. When he was selected to join the crew of Earth's first true deep space defense vessel, a ship named Horizon, after months of committee debate over what to call humanity's first serious step into interstellar capability, he felt a mixture of pride and disbelief that had not fully faded even after a year of training. The Horizon was not a warship in the traditional sense, at least not according to the careful language used by the Compact's Public Relations Office. It was described officially as a defensive research and patrol vessel, designed to protect Earth's expanding interests in nearby systems, while continuing to gather data that would feed back into the joint propulsion and weapons research programs still underway across the planet. Privately, among the crew who trained aboard it, nobody pretended it was anything other than what it truly was, humanity's first genuine attempt to project strength beyond its own solar system. Oliver's commanding officer was a woman named Charlotte Wren, a former naval officer whose calm authority had earned her the respect of a crew drawn from a dozen different nations, many of whom had never worked alongside people from rival countries before joining the Compact. Charlotte ran her ship with a discipline that reminded her crew, again and again, that they represented something larger than any single nation, that every decision made aboard the Horizon carried weight far beyond their own careers or reputations. It was under Charlotte's command that the Horizon received orders, nearly a year after Elena Voss's confrontation with Lord Dravorn, to patrol the outer edge of a system claimed jointly by Earth and a neighboring minor species, under a trade agreement negotiated through the Compact's growing diplomatic efforts. The system held modest but valuable mineral deposits, resources that had become increasingly important to the Compact's expanding industrial base. It was, by galactic standards, an unremarkable assignment, the kind of routine patrol duty that Council fleets conducted constantly across thousands of systems without incident. Nobody aboard the Horizon expected what happened next. Sensors detected the approaching fleet nearly 6 hours before visual confirmation was possible, a formation of Council enforcement vessels moving with the confident, unhurried pace of ships accustomed to encountering no resistance. Charlotte received the report calmly, ordering her crew to maintain standard patrol formation while she assessed the situation. Oliver watched the sensor readings with growing unease, noting the sheer size difference between the approaching fleet and the Horizon's own modest patrol group, 3 vessels against what appeared to be a full enforcement squadron of at least 12 ships. The enforcement fleet was led by an officer named Admiral Thessaly Kor, a veteran commander of the Thren Dominion's naval forces, who had spent decades enforcing Council trade regulations across dozens of systems without ever encountering serious resistance. Kor had been dispatched to the region following a minor dispute over mineral rights, a routine matter that under normal circumstances would have been resolved through a brief show of force, a demonstration intended to remind the young species claiming rights in the system of its proper place within the Council hierarchy. Kor's briefing materials, prepared by Council intelligence analysts who had continued to underestimate Earth's mobilization efforts, described the human presence in the system as minimal and unthreatening, likely to withdraw at the first sign of a proper enforcement fleet. It was, Kor later admitted privately to subordinates, a briefing that proved catastrophically incomplete. As the enforcement fleet closed within communication range, Kor transmitted a standard demand for the human vessels to withdraw from the disputed system, citing Council authority over unresolved territorial claims. Charlotte received the transmission with the same calm discipline that defined her command, consulting briefly with her senior officers before responding. Her reply was polite, measured, and utterly unyielding. She stated simply that the Earth Defense Compact held valid trade agreements for the system in question, negotiated through proper Council channels, and that her vessels would not withdraw absent formal Council arbitration. Kor found the response almost amusing, a young species citing procedural technicalities in the face of overwhelming force. He ordered his fleet to advance further into the system, a standard intimidation maneuver intended to demonstrate the futility of resistance. What he did not expect, what nothing in his decades of experience had prepared him for, was the response that followed. The Horizon and its accompanying vessels did not withdraw, and they did not panic. Instead, they executed a series of coordinated maneuvers that immediately struck Kor's tactical officers as unfamiliar, patterns that matched no known Council doctrine, no recorded strategy from any species currently monitored by Thren intelligence services. The human ships moved with an unpredictable, almost improvisational quality, shifting formation rapidly, using the system's asteroid field for cover in ways that confused the enforcement fleet's targeting systems, which had been calibrated primarily for engagements against predictable, symmetrical opponents. Oliver, seated at his station aboard the Horizon, found himself executing maneuvers drawn from tactics he had studied during training, strategies pulled deliberately from Earth's long and often brutal history of warfare, adapted for a context no human strategist had ever imagined they would apply. Charlotte had insisted during training that the crew study not only modern military doctrine, but centuries of human conflict, believing that Earth's uniquely turbulent history of warfare, for all its tragedy, had produced a deep well of tactical creativity that no single Council species, accustomed to centuries of unchallenged dominance, could easily anticipate. The confrontation that followed lasted less than 20 minutes, though it felt far longer to everyone involved. No weapons were discharged in that time, a fact that both sides would later cite as evidence of restraint, though the reality was more complicated. Kor's fleet, expecting an easy demonstration of force against a compliant, overwhelmed opponent, found itself instead facing ships that refused to behave predictably, that used the terrain of the system itself as a tool, that seemed prepared to make any engagement costly rather than simple. Kor, watching his tactical displays fill with reports of failed targeting locks and confused maneuver predictions, made a decision that would later be studied extensively by Council military historians. He ordered his fleet to withdraw, citing the need for further assessment before proceeding with enforcement action. It was not a defeat in any conventional sense. No ships had been damaged, no lives had been lost. But it was, unmistakably, the first time in recorded Council history that an enforcement fleet had withdrawn from a confrontation with a species holding only observer status, a species the Council had, until recently, considered barely worth acknowledging. News of the confrontation spread quickly through Council communication networks. though the official reports filed by Corps' staff downplayed the significance of the encounter, describing it as a tactical repositioning rather than a withdrawal. The truth proved harder to contain. Crew members aboard Corps' fleet, unaccustomed to the strange unpredictability they had witnessed, spoke openly of the encounter to colleagues across other fleets, and within weeks, the story had spread far beyond its original context, transformed and exaggerated, with each retelling into something approaching legend among species who had spent generations dismissing Earth as insignificant. Elena learned of the confrontation through official council channels nearly a full day after it occurred, receiving a carefully worded briefing from a mid-level council administrator who seemed uncertain how to characterize what had happened. She read the report twice, her hands trembling slightly, before requesting an urgent secure channel to Henry back on Earth. When the connection finally went through, she found Henry already aware of the situation, having received a full account directly from Charlotte Wren within hours of the Horizon's return to friendly space. Their conversation that night stretched for hours, moving between relief that no lives had been lost and anxious uncertainty about what the confrontation might mean for Earth's future within Council space. Henry expressed concern that the incident might be used by Council hardliners as justification for more aggressive action against humanity, a preemptive strike disguised as necessary correction before Earth's growing capabilities became a genuine threat. Elena shared these concerns, though she also found herself experiencing something she had not expected, a quiet, cautious pride in what her people had accomplished, not through aggression, but through simple refusal to be intimidated. Grace Whitfield, monitoring the technical reports filed by the Horizon's crew, found herself fascinated by the tactical data emerging from the confrontation. She spent days analyzing the maneuvers Charlotte's crew had executed, comparing them against Council doctrine obtained through the delegation's limited access to public military archives. Her analysis confirmed what Corps' own officers had already suspected, that Earth's improvisational, historically informed tactics represented a genuine strategic advantage against opponents accustomed to centuries of predictable, symmetrical warfare. She forwarded her findings back to Earth's military research programs, careful to frame her conclusions in defensive rather than aggressive terms, mindful always of the delicate balance Elena continued to urge upon her. Back on Earth, news of the confrontation reached the public through carefully managed official channels, framed deliberately as a defensive success rather than a provocative escalation. Henry understood the importance of controlling the narrative, aware that public reaction to the news could easily tip toward either dangerous overconfidence or renewed anxiety about the risks of continued mobilization. The response, when it came, surprised him with its measured quality. Rather than triumphant celebration or fearful retreat, most public commentary reflected a quiet, steady resolve, a sense that Earth had simply done what needed to be done to protect its interests, without seeking further conflict. Not everyone shared this measured response. Within the Compact's own military leadership, a small but vocal faction began arguing for accelerated expansion of Earth's defensive capabilities, pointing to the confrontation as proof that humanity's unconventional tactics could offset the Council's overwhelming technological advantages. Henry found himself increasingly occupied with internal debates over how quickly the Compact should continue building its capabilities, aware that overreach could provoke exactly the kind of aggressive Council response everyone hoped to avoid. Within the Council itself, the confrontation triggered a different kind of debate, one Elena observed with growing unease from her position within the delegation's offices. Lord Dravorn, whose earlier insult had inadvertently set these events into motion, found himself facing quiet criticism from other senior delegates, who questioned whether his dismissive rhetoric had contributed to Earth's sudden, unexpected mobilization. Dravorn, for his part, showed no public sign of reconsidering his views, continuing to describe Earth's actions as the predictable overreaction of an unstable young species, though Elena noticed a new wariness in how he and other senior delegates discussed humanity in council sessions, a wariness that had not existed before. Admiral Corr, meanwhile, submitted a detailed report to Council Military Command recommending further study of Earth's tactical capabilities before any additional enforcement action was undertaken in human-controlled space. His recommendation was met with mixed reactions among Council leadership, some dismissing his caution as an overreaction to an isolated incident, others recognizing in his careful, detailed analysis the first genuine acknowledgement that Earth might represent something more significant than the Council had previously assumed. As weeks passed following the confrontation, Elena began noticing subtle shifts in how other delegations treated the human table during Council sessions. Representatives from smaller, less powerful species, who had long observed Earth's treatment within the Council with quiet sympathy, began seeking out brief, cautious conversations with Elena and her colleagues, expressing what amounted to informal solidarity with a species that had, however unintentionally, demonstrated that even the newest and least respected members of Council space could not simply be dismissed without consequence. Elena understood, watching these small shifts unfold, that something fundamental had changed in how the galaxy perceived Earth, even if the change remained incomplete, contested, and fragile. The confrontation in the disputed system had not won humanity equal status within the Council, had not erased centuries of condescension and dismissal in a single encounter, but it had planted a seed of doubt in a system that had operated for generations on the assumption that Earth's place among the stars would always remain small, quiet, and subordinate. That seed of doubt, Elena knew, was only the beginning of what would prove to be a far longer and more complicated struggle for genuine recognition, one that would test not only humanity's growing capabilities, but its wisdom in choosing how to wield them. The Council convened an emergency closed session 3 months after the confrontation in the disputed mineral system, a session Elena learned about only hours before it began, through a hurried message delivered by a junior Council administrator who seemed almost apologetic about the short notice. Closed sessions were rare, reserved for matters the Council considered too sensitive for open record, and Elena felt her earlier apprehension return in full force as she prepared to attend, unsure whether she was walking into an opportunity or a trap. Daniel accompanied her to the session, though as an observer's aide he would not be permitted to speak, only to observe and record. Grace remained behind in the delegation's offices, continuing her analysis of the growing stream of technical data flowing in from Earth's expanding research programs. As Elena made her way through the quiet corridors leading to the smaller, more intimate chamber used for closed sessions, she found herself thinking again of Lord Dravorn's words, of the long months since that single insult had set so much into motion, and wondered what new chapter this session might represent. The closed chamber held far fewer delegates than the main assembly, only the senior representatives of the Council's founding species, along with a handful of officials from the Council's military and intelligence divisions. Elena recognized several faces immediately, including Lord Dravorn, seated near the center of the chamber with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Admiral Kor was also present, a notable inclusion, given his direct involvement in the confrontation that had prompted this session in the first place. The Council speaker opened the session by acknowledging, in careful diplomatic language, that recent events involving the human delegation had prompted a broader reassessment of Earth's status within Council space. Elena listened closely, trying to read beneath the formal phrasing for any hint of what direction this reassessment might take. The speaker continued, noting that Earth's demonstrated capabilities, while still far below the technological standards of established Council members, had proven sufficient to raise legitimate questions about the appropriateness of continuing to treat humanity as a species unworthy of meaningful participation in Council governance. Admiral Kor was invited to present his findings from the confrontation, and Elena watched carefully as he rose to address the chamber, his tone measured and professional, entirely absent the condescension she had grown accustomed to hearing whenever Earth was discussed in Council settings. Kor described, in careful technical detail, the tactical capabilities demonstrated by the Horizon and its accompanying vessels, emphasizing not simply the unpredictability of human maneuvers, but the deeper strategic principle underlying them, a willingness to make any confrontation costly, regardless of the odds. An approach, he noted, was rooted in centuries of human conflict that had produced, however tragically, a uniquely adaptive military tradition. Kor concluded his presentation with a recommendation that surprised many in the chamber, suggesting that continued dismissal of Earth's growing capabilities risked provoking exactly the kind of destabilizing conflict the Council had spent centuries working to avoid across its member territories. He argued, carefully but firmly, that engagement and negotiation now offered a far safer path forward than continued condescension, which he warned could eventually push Earth toward more drastic and unpredictable action. Lord Dravorn responded to Kor's presentation with visible skepticism, questioning whether a single tactical encounter truly justified reconsidering centuries of established council policy regarding newly contacted species. He argued that granting Earth expanded status now, in direct response to what he characterized as a minor military posturing, would set a dangerous precedent, encouraging other young species to pursue confrontation rather than patient integration into council norms. Elena felt her earlier anger returning as she listened to Dravorn's arguments, though she forced herself to remain outwardly composed, aware that any visible reaction could undermine whatever fragile progress this session might represent. She noticed, however, that Dravorn's arguments received a cooler reception than they might have months earlier, several delegates exchanging glances that suggested growing impatience with his continued dismissiveness. It was at this point that the speaker turned to Elena directly, inviting her, for the first time in her 6 years of service, to address the closed session formally rather than simply observe. Elena rose slowly, aware of the weight of the moment, aware that whatever she said now would shape not only this session, but potentially the entire trajectory of Earth's relationship with the Council going forward. She spoke carefully, deliberately avoiding the raw emotion that had characterized her earlier confrontation with Dravorn, choosing instead a tone of measured resolve. She acknowledged the concerns raised by Dravorn regarding precedent, but argued that the true precedent at stake was not whether young species should be rewarded for confrontation, but whether the Council was prepared to acknowledge growth and capability wherever it appeared, regardless of a species' age or origin. She reminded the chamber that Earth had not sought conflict, had responded only when directly confronted, and had consistently pursued diplomatic channels even while building the capabilities necessary to defend its interests. She spoke of the years of patient observation Earth had endured, the insults absorbed in silence, the careful diplomacy pursued even as humanity worked quietly to close the vast technological gap separating it from the Council's oldest members. She argued that Earth's recent actions represented not recklessness but the natural response of any species pushed too long toward the margins of a system it had genuinely hoped to join as an equal partner. When she finished speaking, the chamber remained silent for a long moment, delegates exchanging glances, weighing the implications of what they had heard. The speaker eventually called for a preliminary vote, not on Earth's full membership status, a matter too significant to resolve within a single closed session, but on a more modest proposal, granting Earth expanded consultative status, a designation that would allow human representatives to participate more actively in council deliberations, affecting matters relevant to human interests, though still short of full voting membership. The vote passed by a narrow but clear margin, a result that would have seemed unimaginable to Elena only a year earlier. She felt a complicated wave of emotion as the outcome was announced, relief mixed with a lingering awareness that this represented only a partial step, not the full recognition humanity ultimately sought, but a genuine and meaningful shift nonetheless. News of the session's outcome reached Earth within hours, and Henry found himself once again at the center of an emergency assembly session, this time called not to respond to insult or crisis but to celebrate, however cautiously, a genuine diplomatic achievement. He addressed the assembly with careful words, reminding delegates that expanded consultative status represented progress but not victory, that the work of building genuine equal standing within council space remained far from complete. Public reaction across Earth reflected a similar mixture of celebration and caution. Streets in several major cities filled with impromptu gatherings as news spread, people gathering not in anger this time but in something closer to collective relief and pride, a sense that the long, difficult path toward genuine recognition had finally, however incrementally, begun moving in the right direction. Yet alongside the celebration, sober voices in media and government alike cautioned against complacency, reminding the public that expanded consultative status remained a modest gain, that the deeper work of proving Earth's readiness for full partnership within council space had only just begun. Grace Whitfield, watching the reaction unfold from her post within the delegation's offices, found herself reflecting on how far humanity had traveled in the relatively short span since Lord Dravorn's original insult. She thought of the countless researchers back on Earth who had spent months working around the clock on the joint propulsion and defense initiatives that had ultimately made this diplomatic breakthrough possible, understanding that the technical achievements underlying Earth's new standing were every bit as important as the political negotiations that had secured it. Daniel, reviewing the formal council documentation confirming Earth's new consultative status, noted quietly to Elena that the language used throughout the agreement remained careful, hedged, filled with qualifications that left ample room for the council to reverse course if humanity's continued development proved, in the council's judgment, too destabilizing. Elena acknowledged the concern, understanding that the fragile progress achieved through this closed session represented not an ending but merely a new, more complicated chapter in humanity's ongoing effort to secure its place among the stars. That evening, as the delegation's offices finally quieted following a day of urgent communications and careful diplomatic follow-up, Elena found herself once again alone in the main council chamber, now empty and dim, staring up at Earth's column of light. It remained smaller than the columns representing the council's oldest and most powerful species, a visible reminder of how far humanity still had to travel. But for the first time since her arrival on Visara nearly 7 years earlier, Elena noticed something different in its glow, a steadiness that had not been there before, as though the column itself understood that its light, however modest, would no longer be so easily ignored. She thought of Lord Dravorn's words from that first fateful session, the phrase that had set so much into motion, and found herself, unexpectedly, almost grateful for the insult that had forced humanity to finally stop waiting patiently for a recognition that might never have come on its own. She understood now that Earth's journey toward genuine equality within council space remained far from finished, that the coming months and years would likely bring further tests, further challenges, further moments requiring the same resolve that had carried humanity this far. But standing alone in that quiet chamber, watching Earth's light hold steady against the vast darkness surrounding it, Elena allowed herself, finally, to believe that whatever challenges lay ahead, Earth would face them not as a silent observer, but as a species that had, at last, found its voice. A full year passed before the council took up the question of Earth's status again, a year that Elena would later describe, in private conversations with Henry, as the longest and most demanding period of her entire career on Visara. Expanded consultative status had opened doors that remained firmly closed before, allowing Elena and her small delegation to participate in working groups on trade regulation, resource allocation, and territorial disputes that directly affected human interests. But participation without a vote meant Earth's voice, however now audible, still carried less weight than those of established members, a frustration that grew more pronounced as the delegation found itself repeatedly offering recommendations that were heard politely and then set aside in favor of the preferences of older, more established species. During this period, Earth continued its rapid development under the Compact's coordinated efforts, though the character of that development shifted subtly as the initial urgency following Lord Dravorn's insult gave way to something more sustainable, more methodical. Grace Whitfield, whose analysis of Council military doctrine had proven invaluable in the aftermath of the confrontation in the disputed system, found herself increasingly focused on civilian applications of the technologies emerging from the Compact's research programs. Propulsion systems that promised to dramatically reduce travel times between Earth and its expanding network of trade partners. Medical technologies developed through careful, respectful exchange with Council scientists, who had grown genuinely curious about human approaches to biology and medicine that differed markedly from their own species' traditions. This period also saw the emergence of quieter, more personal connections between humans and members of other Council species, connections that Elena believed ultimately did more to shift galactic perceptions of Earth than any single dramatic confrontation ever could. Daniel developed a genuine working friendship with a young diplomat from a minor species called the Ferindi, whose own world had endured centuries of marginalization within Council space, before slowly earning greater recognition through patient, persistent effort. Their conversations, conducted over long evenings in Visara's public gathering halls, gave Elena valuable insight into how other historically overlooked species had navigated similar struggles, insight she used carefully in shaping the delegation's ongoing diplomatic strategy. It was during one such conversation, relayed to Elena by Daniel, that the Ferindi diplomat mentioned something that would prove pivotal in the months ahead, a growing dissatisfaction among several of the Council's mid-tier member species regarding the outsized influence wielded by founding members like the Thren Dominion. This dissatisfaction, the diplomat explained, had simmered quietly for generations, constrained by the practical reality that no single mid-tier species possessed sufficient standing to challenge the founding members' dominance alone. But Earth's recent, unexpected demonstration of resolve had begun shifting perceptions across these mid-tier species, offering a potential model for how a determined, unified approach might eventually alter the Council's deeply entrenched power structures. Elena recognized immediately the significance of this shifting sentiment, understanding that Earth's path toward full recognition might depend less on directly confronting powerful figures like Lord Dravorn, and more on building genuine coalitions with species who shared, in their own ways, a similar frustration with the Council's rigid hierarchy. She began, carefully and patiently, cultivating relationships with delegates from these mid-tier species, using the expanded access granted by Earth's consultative status to build trust and mutual understanding that had never before been possible. Henry, back on Earth, pursued a parallel strategy, working to establish formal trade and cultural exchange agreements with several of these species, agreements that went beyond the narrow, transactional relationships the Council had traditionally permitted young member species to pursue. These agreements, though modest in immediate economic impact, carried significant symbolic weight, demonstrating that Earth intended to build genuine, lasting partnerships across Council space, rather than simply seeking recognition from the Council's most powerful founding members. The turning point came nearly 14 months after the closed session that had granted Earth expanded consultative status, when a routine dispute over trade regulations in a distant system unexpectedly escalated into a broader crisis, threatening to destabilize relations among several mid-tier Council species. The dispute centered on competing claims to a resource-rich region that bordered territories controlled by 3 different species, each with legitimate historical claims that had never been fully resolved under existing Council frameworks. As tensions escalated and diplomatic efforts among the directly involved species repeatedly stalled, Elena found herself, almost by accident, positioned as an unlikely mediator, trusted by all 3 parties, precisely because Earth's own recent struggles for recognition had earned it a reputation for genuine fairness, untainted by the old rivalries and historical grievances that complicated relations among the Council's more established members. She approached the mediation with the same careful, measured resolve that had characterized her earlier confrontation with Lord Dravorn, listening patiently to each side's concerns, proposing compromises grounded in genuine understanding, rather than the condescending arbitration that Council founding members typically imposed on disputes among younger species. Her efforts succeeded where months of prior negotiation had failed, producing a framework agreement that satisfied all 3 parties, and prevented what many Council officials privately acknowledged could have escalated into a far more serious conflict. The successful mediation sent ripples through Council space, prompting even skeptical delegates to acknowledge that Earth's growing diplomatic skill matched, and in some cases exceeded, the capabilities of species with far longer histories of Council membership. Lord Dravorn, watching these developments unfold with the same wary attention he had maintained since the confrontation in the disputed mineral system, found his position within the Council increasingly isolated. Other founding members, initially sympathetic to his skepticism regarding Earth's rapid rise, began distancing themselves from his continued dismissiveness, as evidence mounted that humanity's growing influence reflected genuine capability, rather than mere posturing. Even Admiral Kor, whose earlier report had first challenged the prevailing Council consensus regarding Earth, found himself increasingly cited as a voice of foresight, rather than caution, his recommendations regarding engagement over confrontation proving prescient, as Earth's constructive influence within Council space continued to expand. The formal proposal to grant Earth full voting membership within the Council came before the General Assembly nearly 18 months after Elena's initial confrontation with Lord Dravorn, sponsored not by any single powerful founding member, but by a coalition of mid-tier species who had grown to trust and respect Earth's contributions to Council stability. Elena received word of the proposal with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope, aware that even with this growing coalition of support, the outcome remained far from certain. The assembly session convened, To consider the proposal drew a larger gathering than any Elena had witnessed since her arrival on Visara. Delegates from every corner of council space, filling the great chamber, to observe a debate that many recognized as a genuinely pivotal moment in the council's long history. Elena sat at the human delegation's table, flanked by Daniel and Grace, watching as delegate after delegate rose to speak, some in support, some still expressing reservations, the debate stretching across nearly the entire session as the full weight of the decision settled over the chamber. Lord Dravorn rose to speak against the proposal, his arguments familiar, but delivered with noticeably less confidence than his original dismissal of Earth had carried nearly 2 years earlier. He acknowledged, with visible reluctance, that Earth had demonstrated genuine capability and diplomatic skill exceeding initial council expectations, but argued nonetheless that full voting membership remained premature, that Earth's rapid rise, however impressive, had not yet been tested across the kind of extended time frame the Council traditionally required before extending full recognition to new members. When Elena rose to respond, she felt none of the raw, unscripted emotion that had characterized her original defiance in this same chamber nearly 2 years earlier. Instead, she spoke with the calm, practiced authority of someone who had spent 2 years proving, through action rather than mere words, that Earth belonged among the stars, as a genuine equal partner, rather than a tolerated observer. She reminded the chamber of Earth's successful mediation of the recent territorial crisis, of the trade and cultural agreements Earth had built across dozens of mid-tier species, of the technological achievements that had allowed humanity to close, in less than 2 years, a gap that Council intelligence had once assumed would take generations to bridge. She acknowledged Dravorn's concerns regarding the pace of Earth's rise, but argued that the true measure of readiness for Council membership lay not in the passage of time, but in demonstrated character, in a species' willingness to pursue genuine partnership rather than mere self-interest. She pointed to Earth's careful restraint throughout its rapid mobilization, its consistent preference for diplomacy over confrontation, even as it built the capabilities necessary to defend its interests, its willingness to serve as an honest, trusted mediator in disputes that did not directly concern its own interests. She argued that these qualities, more than any measure of raw technological capability, represented the true foundation of genuine readiness for full Council membership. The vote that followed remained close, closer than many observers had expected given the growing coalition of support Earth had built across mid-tier species, but it passed, granting humanity full voting membership within the Galactic Council, for the first time since first contact nearly 2 decades earlier. The announcement triggered an eruption of reaction across the chamber unlike anything Elena had witnessed in her years of service, delegates from dozens of species rising to acknowledge the historic nature of the moment, even Lord Dravorn, in a gesture that surprised many observers, offering a brief, formal acknowledgement of Earth's achievement, though his expression remained carefully neutral. News of the vote reached Earth within hours, triggering celebrations across every continent, unlike anything the planet had witnessed since the earliest days of human spaceflight. Henry Cross addressed a global broadcast audience that night, his voice carrying the weight of 2 years spent building the fragile coalition of nations that had ultimately made this historic achievement possible. He spoke not of triumph over the Council, but of a longer journey finally reaching its next chapter, reminding the world that genuine partnership among the stars would require continued effort, continued growth, continued willingness to prove, again and again, that Earth's place among the Council's member species was earned, rather than merely granted. Grace Whitfield, watching the celebrations unfold from Vesera, alongside Elena and Daniel, found herself thinking of the countless researchers, engineers, and scientists across Earth, whose tireless work over the preceding 2 years had made this moment possible, understanding that the historic vote represented not the achievement of any single individual, but the collective determination of an entire species, finally choosing, after decades of quiet marginalization, to claim its rightful place among the stars. Elena, standing once more in the great council chamber as the session finally dispersed, found herself gazing up at Earth's column of light, which now, for the first time since her arrival on Visara, glowed with a brightness that matched the columns of the Council's oldest and most established members. She thought back to that first fateful session, to Lord Dravorn's cold dismissal, to the insult that had cut so deep, It had finally broken through decades of patient, careful restraint. She understood now, standing in that transformed chamber, that the insult meant to remind humanity of its insignificance had instead become the spark that finally ignited humanity's long-dormant resolve, the moment that had transformed Earth from a silent, overlooked observer into a genuine, respected partner among the stars. As she finally turned to leave the chamber, Daniel and Grace beside her, Elena allowed herself a rare, genuine smile, understanding that whatever challenges lay ahead in this new chapter of Earth's journey among the stars, humanity would face them not as a species defined by what others once said about it, but as one that had, through resolve, unity, and quiet, unyielding determination, finally proven exactly what it was capable of becoming.